I like this definition of cisgender, cis. It simply means that when a parent or doctor delivered you and called you a boy or girl when you were born, they got it right. Honestly. But it's all right. All violence. Actually, Craig would be about it, but he joins us now. Craig Stobo, obviously New Zealand's leading economic and political commentator, in my view. Craig Stobo joins us now. Craig, you're a white cis male. Did you ever get offended when Marama Davidson suggested that all violence is due basically to you and your type?
I didn't even know what cis was until 2 or 3 years ago, Michael. So,
no, neither did I.
Yeah. So it's a whole new world of understanding other people's perspectives, but I didn't know I was an object of concern from another group in society.
Object of derision and upset for another group in society. Yes, indeed.
Clearly.
All right, now, mate, you're coming on the show a bit earlier. You used to come on a Thursday, but today is the absolutely apposite time to have you on, because yesterday Treasury released its pre-election fiscal update. I was just commenting, Craig, prior when I introduced the topic this morning, that would have been known to Grant Robertson or the figures weeks beforehand, and certainly he signed it off about a week ago, so the Prime Minister would know it as well. It didn't stop them in any way, shape or form, though, from promising new things, and there have been more promises made this morning about new doctors to be trained. My wife said to me last night she thought this was an election of bribery, and how long would this carry on through to the day? What's your take on what the preview did yesterday and what the response of the political parties is?
Yeah, so Finance Minister Robertson would have signed off a couple of weeks ago, and hence the release of revisions to the budget, I think, numbers of about $4 billion in expenditure cuts over 4 years, and that was put in for the budget prior to it being signed off to lessen the deficits that were announced yesterday. So you're quite right. The Minister did sign off and he made those changes which the Treasury adopted. Of course, this document doesn't include lots of election promises. It only includes policies that the government of the day tells the Treasury that they will implement, which is a policy, but promises are slightly different. So they're not in there, and certainly yesterday's announcements wouldn't have been in the preview. So just wanted to sort of talk very generally about it rather than detail, and get to perspectives on what does it mean for the parties. So if I just focus on the short term, so it is instructive that the core operating deficit worsens to June next year. In fact, it's 1% worse than the budget numbers in May. So we're in September, and the May budget is obviously in May. It's got worse by 1% in a tiny amount of time. Now, the discussion has been around corporate tax take is a lot lower, but there's not much change going on in expenditure. And so you look at the debt profile as a track as well. So I'm talking about trends here, not necessarily in the detail, just the trend. So the deficit's getting worse as a result of these pressures. Net debt to government, to GDP, to the size of the economy, is increasing from 19% in 2018 when Labor and New Zealand first took office. The projection is that rises to 40% in 2027. So we're doubling our net debt. Now the gross debt, so that's just gross debt, not taking into account assets owned by taxpayers such as OCC or the NZ Super Fund, gross debt gets up to $200 billion, which is why the government announced increases in the debt borrowing program yesterday, cumulatively of $9 billion over the next 3 or 4 years. And that's not talking about repayment, that's just simply rolling over and issuing more to cover those operating deficits. And that excludes, obviously, election promises, it excludes entities like Kāinga Ora, which are now being funded by the government rather than by themselves. So I then look at what does the Treasury think of all these trends, and therefore what taxpayers should think about is the following quote. In recent times, government's final allocations have exceeded the budget allowances, the signalled budget allowances. If this trend was to continue and no corresponding offset from either increases in revenue or falls in expenses, there will be an adverse impact on the fiscal outlook. Now, that's pretty strong words from the Secretary of the Treasury, signaling to taxpayers that these trends can't continue. So I then look at the parties, the core parties in the middle, National and Labor, and National has a tax package that stands by itself, and that's been made very, very clear. It's independent of the pre-food and these forecasts. And Labor has said what they said around promises, etc., which are a combination of more spending promises. So I think the elephant in the room is that no one is talking about reining in government expenditure. This is in the core parties, reining in government expenditure to stop the deteriorating domestic deficits and the rising government debt, which has to be funded by interest and eventually repayment. And it's like no one wants to talk about it. And I don't think that's acceptable. I think we need these parties to tell us what they're going to do about these deficits and the worsening debt profile. We then get to a situation and say, what is all this debt done? What have we got for this debt since we closed the borders and started that debt profile that I mentioned? Where's the accountability for that debt profile that we're inheriting? And what have we got for it? Where are the assets that have been created? It's gone into effectively living expenses. It hasn't gone into investment. And the last thing I want to say is that while the Minister has been clear that the economic outlook was a little bit more rosy than others might have thought yesterday, with small increases in GDP growth, it's higher than the RBNZ's projections. So where two important parts of the government are at odds with each other over the growth track. Adrian Orr very clearly said in January, cool your jets. This government's expenditure forecasts and deficit forecasts don't indicate that they're cooling the jets. And the IMF has already said to us, and I mentioned this to you a couple of weeks ago, that the fiscal impulse is around 1.8% of GDP. In other words, the government's adding more wood to the fire, which means and explains why the interest rate track in the forecast is higher for longer. This is all going to impact on interest costs, which affect businesses, big and small, and household borrowers. That's where all of this will turn into stickier inflation and much higher interest rates than we all want. And I haven't even spoken yet about what will happen if either the parties on the right, National and or ACT, decide to remove the twin objectives of the RBNZ from full employment and inflation to just inflation. If that happens, that will also underpin higher rates for longer. I just wish the parties would talk about what they're going to do structurally about this problem. I'm not getting it.
So you think it's clearly a deliberate policy, you think, not to talk about it. Why? Because it would mean that all the promises that they've made would not be able to be afforded, Craig?
Correct. Well, they can be, but it comes at a cost of higher interest rates for longer, doesn't it? And while you might argue that our net debt to GDP is lower than the median OECD equivalent or peer, the rate of change in our net debt to GDP means that we're fast approaching that median. And people aren't recognising the speed of change going on, which we're a small open economy in the South Pacific on a fault line, and we need low debt to GDP numbers to cater for those instances where we get extreme weather or we get earthquakes. We don't want to be near the median because we don't have a range of opportunities to sell goods and services around the world that others do. We're limited to a smaller range of an ability to increase our standard of living. We need a safety net. We need a buffer. And to say that we're better than the median is not good enough because we're different to the median for good reasons. And so we need a different debt profile.
I looked at the executive summary yesterday, Craig, and there's a table. The first table is the key economic and fiscal indicators that's there. I guess that's the one that most people would have gone to, and that's the one that Treasury wants you to look at first. And in that, the 2023 forecast is that we'll need to borrow $10 billion. That's the gap between expenditure and income for the government. And then 2024, 11.4, and then 2025, 6.2. That presumes all of the current... Can I just clarify? That would presume all of the current policies of the government it wouldn't have factored in the election promises of either Labour or National, would it?
Correct.
So you're arguing, how are you going to be able to afford that when those are the figures without you doing anything?
Yeah, there needs to be a little bit of clarity around exactly what's in and what's out. But unless the Treasury gets the instructions from the Crown that will be policy and it can be funded, it sits as a promise that has yet to come to the account. So when we hear promises from politicians, we need to understand whether it's in the pre-fu or out of the pre-fu. And if it's out of the pre-fu, how are you going to fund it? Is it funded by tax, or is it funded by debt, or does it just mean got to have a reallocation from some other expenditure?